Okay, so in this first segment, the plan's going to be to try to get a synchronic understanding of Buddhism as a world religion. And I'd like to begin with some details about the origin of Buddhism in post Vedic India, sometime around 500 BC, which is roughly around the same time that we saw the emergence of Jainism last time. Unlike Jainism, we're a bit more confident that that Buddhism had a single founder, and he was a fellow by the name of Siddhartha Gautama, or Gautama as he's called in Pali. The traditional dates for when Gautama lived are 566 to 486 BC, and it's based on when this famous Maurya king Ashoka lived. There's a number of texts that say that Ashoka was installed as king 218 years after the death of the Buddha. But the famous Buddhologist Richard Gombrich has said that this number should actually be read as 136 and not 218. That would mean that we have to adjust the Buddha's dates actually to be 82 years later at 484 to 404 BC. Now, no matter which dates you accept, it's clear that Gautama was a junior contemporary to Mahavira, who is the founder of Jainism. We also know that Gautama lived basically in the same place as Mahavira, these areas of eastern India that got swallowed up by an imperializing Magadha. Like Mahavira, Gautama came from a royal background. His parents were Kshatriyas who belonged to the Shakya clan. They ruled a small kingdom that's near today's India-Nepal border at a city called Kapilavastu. And like Mahavira also, Gautama renounced his worldly life and all his royal responsibilities. He left the life of luxury to kind of seek his pathway to liberation from suffering and death. One difference between them maybe was that Gautama actually first tried out a bunch of different paths before creating his own. He first hung out with Upanishadic thinkers, with Jains, with Ajivikas, and a bunch of other renunciant traditions that were already popular at the time. Eventually, though, the Buddha was dissatisfied with all of them, and he crafted his own way, which he called the middle path, that avoided both extreme self-indulgence and also extreme self-denial, which he felt like some groups were doing, like the Jains. So what did this middle way look like? Here's a few core principles that we can say were at the heart of early Buddhism. One of the most important and also the kind of most confounding of the Buddha's ideas is called anatta in Pali, or anatman in Sanskrit. This is the theory of no self, the idea that there's actually no such thing as a permanent soul, no special thing that makes you, you, and me, that makes you feel like you're alive. Right? Instead, your being is simply a convergence of different material aggregates, heaps of things that come together in such a way that it kind of fools you into thinking that you have a self, a soul, an Atman. The implication of this idea, and it's a big one, right, is that there's no permanent soul that transmigrates from one body to another during the process of rebirth. Rebirth is still the thing we're trying to avoid, but unlike the other movements that we were talking about before, the point is not to liberate some trapped or hidden entity from this samsara process, but rather to come to the very realization that that entity doesn't actually exist. Once we realize our Atman doesn't exist, then we're free. The idea goes hand in hand with the second of the Buddha's principles, called anicca, or in Pali, and anitya in Sanskrit. This is the idea that there's nothing permanent. All entities are in a continuous process of change, of decay, of death. In other words, there's no imperishable Brahman that those Upanishads had talked about that we're trying to merge our souls into. Another core principle of Buddhism is that our suffering, our dukkha, is fundamentally connected to these two other things, anicca and anatta. Because we experience change and deterioration of all the things that we hold dear, including the self, we experience pain. Because we're fully invested in the reality of ourselves, we're unable to divest from this pain. If we can divest, the Buddhists say, we'll ultimately be able to achieve a state of perfect cognition and freedom. And this state was called Nibbana in Pali, or Nirvana in Sanskrit. Literally means extinguishment, like what you do with a flame on a candle. And they use this parable. When you put out a candle, it can no longer light other candles. Similarly, the idea is that when you erase all active karma that belongs to you, you'll no longer be reborn. Another important concept in the Buddha's middle path, something that sets this philosophy off from others, is the emphasis on 4 different kinds of meditative states, or jhanas, which allow Buddhist practitioners to kind of step by step eliminate their attachments and cravings that are involved in the causal chains of karma. Buddhist monks and nuns try to achieve these kind of succeedingly more difficult jhana states to ultimately arrive at the state of nibbana. Okay, so what are some of the practical features of Buddhism? Well, Buddhism can be described as having 3 jewels, Triratna as it's called. There's the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha. Buddha is the original founder of the faith himself. Dhamma are his teachings and doctrines that have come down to us. And the Sangha is the monastic community, the monks and nuns, who represent the kind of everyday social dimension of the faith. The social side of Buddhism is bifurcated, just like Jainism, in the monastic orders versus the lay community. The monks and nuns renounce their worldly lives and property. They focus only on pursuing nibbana through a spiritual regimen of meditation and other religious practices. On the flip side, the lay Buddhist community is asked to support the renunciant community through food, shelter, clothing, donations, protection, other kinds of support. Helping renunciant monks, just like in Jainism, gives lay donors great religious merit, punya, which is supposed to help you get to a better next life, a better rebirth, and as well as give you social prestige in this life. Also, like Jainism, Buddhism was called a shamana religion. This meant that they rejected the authority of the Vedas. They said that the Vedic texts were basically hogwash. Rituals don't do anything. The Brahmin priests don't naturally have any kind of divine power different than the rest of us, and that Brahmins are not superior to other social classes. Overall, the Buddhist monastic orders appear to have been have fostered a kind of egalitarian scene. They freely admitted women as nuns, for example. Also, like Jains, the Buddhists used vernacular languages instead of Sanskrit, at least in its earliest phases. The older texts of what's known as the Theravada sect all were composed in a vernacular language called Pali and not in Sanskrit. In Mahayana sects, however, they eventually translated the whole canon into Sanskrit, and then it went into even other languages like Chinese or Tibetan and so on. So what are these 2 divisions of Theravada and Mahayana that I just mentioned? Let's take a quick look at those 2 and then wrap up the segment. Theravada literally means the doctrine of the elders, the Theras. And it's the kind of Buddhism that's today it's practiced in Sri Lanka and much of Southeast Asia as well. Theravada canon is preserved in this language of Pali that I just mentioned. The language was probably not exactly what the Buddha spoke, but I don't think it was too far off from what he spoke. Mahayana means the greater vehicle, and it represents the type of Buddhism that spread through the overland route along the Silk Road into Tibet, Mongolia, China, Korea, Japan. These traditions translated the Buddhist canonical texts first into the elite classical language of Sanskrit, and then into a number of Asian languages along that path. The doctrinal differences between the 2 traditions are largely based on what they think happened to the Buddha after he died. According to the Theravada tradition, after the physical death of the Buddha, he attained Nibbana, and he disappeared. He was gone, basically. The Sanskrit word they use for this is the Tathagata. He's gone like that, basically. For that reason, at the beginning, there weren't any iconic representations of the Buddha in Theravada temples. There weren't images or statues. There were things like footprints of the Buddha, or the relics of the Buddha, pieces of his bones or hair, or symbols of the Buddha, like a lotus, or just large and iconic monuments like stupas. But statues or images don't appear until about 100 CE. Nowadays, of course, Theravada temples, like in Myanmar or Thailand or whatever, have tons of statues and images of the Buddha. It wasn't the case in that early period. In the Mahayana tradition, in contrast, there was an idea that at the moment of physical death, the Buddha could have reached Nibbana and escaped rebirth, but he felt a kind of overwhelming compassion towards the rest of us. So he chose to remain right at the very edge of Nibbana, suspended in a kind of perpetual Buddhahood. And he's there to help us even now whenever we pray to him. This state is called being a bodhisattva, a Buddha to be. And there's lots of them besides Gautama in the Mahayana traditions. Bodhisattvas function kind of like gods in other religions. You can pray to them at temples, and they'll help you with everyday problems and sufferings. Right? For that reason, the Mahayana traditions have always been iconic. And you've already, I'm sure, seen a lot of the great Buddhist art from Gandhara or Tibet to China, Japan, and so on. Further developments along this line of thought that the bodhisattvas don't actually escape rebirth but hang on right on the edge, they've led to the advent of the Tibetan tantric tradition of Buddhism that gets called Vajrayana, or the diamond vehicle. And here mantras, mandalas, and other magical devices are used through meditative states in order to kind of harness and unlock inner spiritual powers. It was a tradition that would have a deep and profound engagement with Hindu tantric traditions and even early yoga traditions in the first millennium. Now, that was a kind of quick and dirty overview of the two major sectarian divisions of Buddhism. When we come back, we'll be focusing on the beginnings of this great world religion, in particular on the life of the man who founded it, the one and only Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha. So keep it locked, and we'll see you in a bit.